Hello, everyone. This morning I caught up on Star Trek Lower Decks. I actually had 3 episodes to watch. I just finished watching those and I'm going to go ahead and talk about my immediate reactions to them. I was actually gone for almost 2 weeks with a family trip down to Florida, to Disney, so that's why I haven't been keeping up with these. It was a lot of fun, and actually had a couple funny Star Trek moments, because it's crazy hot and humid down there. It was nothing but shorts and t-shirt weather, and a lot of my t-shirts, probably the majority, are in some way Star Trek themed. So I was walking around Disney with a lot of Star Trek shirts, and my hat has the Enterprise D on it, and just very decked out in jean, walking in the land of Walt. And I had a couple instances at multiple parks and multiple times where Star Trek fans would say something about my shirts, or come greet me, and it was kind of a fun thing to just in this environment see other Trekkies, and to see how it was a variety of. The one guy was probably in his 60s, another one was a couple of kids who were maybe early 20s. So that was just kind of a fun thing to see. I always like randomly stumbling across other Trekkies in the most unusual places. First up, we have episode 3, In the Cradle of Exelon. A 2-part story. The A story takes place on a planet that is governed by an ancient supercomputer that has been malfunctioning and is in need of some repairs or update. And while the captain and Commander Ransom are directly trying to work with the computer, Lieutenant Boimler is now experiencing his first real command of an away mission with a team of ensigns, and T'Lyn, who is a perfect balance for this moment. That was a good choice for his other officer, companion for this, as he struggles with the changes to expectations and his role with his new promotion. And that's one of the themes that carries on through both the A and B plot, and that element of the episode I thought was handled well. Boimler does not handle the situation well. He's really struggling to adjust and trying to find a way to fulfill that leadership role. He really doesn't feel comfortable yet, and he screws it up completely by taking too much control, attempting at first to lead by example, but then just kind of taking over and not showing trust in his fellow officers, the ensigns who are with him, as he feels very uncomfortable giving them orders. And the whole thing works well because it's believable that he would struggle with that, and T'Lyn's presence, because her dry, sarcastic, very serious observational humor and quips work well and help him realize that. So hopefully he will grow very quickly in episodes from that position and learn to fulfill the expectations of the new role. And T'Lyn very quickly, even in this episode now, just for the first few episodes in here, I think might be my new favorite character. I really like her presence, and that's more my style of humor, I think. I think she's a great mix to the whole batch. At the same time, the rest of our cast is on the Cerritos. Tendi, Mariner, and Rutherford are also struggling to adjust to their new roles, as their expectations of how much life and their workload and the type of things they're doing maybe aren't quite matching reality at the moment, and they go through sort of a hazing feeling, very busy work type activity. And so the whole episode, I think in that regard, as far as them dealing with the promotions and how it changes their lives and their expectations versus reality, that part was handled very well. The one thing I didn't like was a lot of the humor in this one relied too heavily on incompetence and bad decision making, which can, in the case of like Boimler, it worked, and I thought that worked out very, very well. I really didn't like what they did with Captain Freeman in this, and even Commander Ransom was with her the whole time. It seems almost in disbelief for sure. Her mistakes and her incompetence in how she handles the repair of the supercomputer felt not quite believable. She does have a tendency, even in her report and previous seasons and her interactions, she does have a tendency to not delegate well and be a little too micromanaging and a little too hands-on. But I think here it was brought a little bit too much to an extreme where it wasn't believable that she would not have engineers with her doing this, even if she was poking in her nose in a little bit too much into what they were doing. It just felt a little odd, and I don't know, that some of the humor didn't quite land because of that element. But overall, it was still a good episode. And I'm not saying I disliked it. I just think that there are elements that really, really worked and I loved, and I thought did a good job of exploring these characters in their changing roles and their budgeting careers. But there are some parts I thought that felt a little flat. Moving on to the next episode, we have Something Borrowed, Something Green. And similar to the last one, this has, for me, a very strong A story, a much better one this time, and a slightly weaker B story. In the A story, Tendi is invited back to Orion to her sister's wedding, and she begrudgingly takes Mariner and T'Lyn with her. Mariner is, of course, just curious and also wants to learn a little more about Tendi, as she's always been very closed off in regards to her Orion heritage, which piques Mariner's curiosity. And then also, because Tendi is such a warm, open individual, there's that extra layer of mystery because she's very unwilling to go into depth with her Orion heritage. And then T'Lyn is just curious because there really, almost like the audience, there really is not that much known about Orion culture. The Orions have always been very fascinating, something that originated, of course, in the original Star Trek, and they've made appearances over the years. And more has been explored in the forms of comics and novels than on screen. It's really interesting now this era of Trek has delved more into Orion culture, and we get to see a lot more of that on screen, both in Strange New Worlds and, of course, in Lower Decks, and having an Orion character as one of the main characters. A lot of my favorite episodes have been ones involving looking into Tendi's past and her relationship to her culture and the conflict in herself, trying to separate herself a bit from it and be this different Starfleet version of herself that she always wished to be since she was a kid, and trying to find that balancing act when she has to delve deep into her Orion roots in moments. And I think that there's going to be very good character growth, particularly starting within this episode, of her kind of coming to terms with who she was and who she is to become a more complete sense of self and be less ashamed of her past. There's a lot of parallels to Spock in some weird ways with her character, very obviously completely different portrayal of the conflict, but there is that still that internal conflict of culture and trying to figure out, who you really are and that balance between different parts of yourself. And I really enjoyed that plot line, and getting to explore her character and having the presence of T'Lyn and Mariner as that outside perspective gave some more interesting, more fun and funny moments in that exploration of that character. You really need that stranger in a strange land observer to make these things work, and I thought that was a great story. The B story was a little bit, it was okay, but again, it didn't really add a whole lot. You did have Boimler and Rutherford struggling a bit with their new dynamic as they are now roommates, and that was a good thing to explore, and that was handled okay. But it went a little too far into the goofy territory with the Holodeck Mark Twain element. That was fine when they were playing off each other, and that was part of their conflict. And of course, there's always the little callbacks and Easter eggs to Star Trek, and I always liked that silly, over-the-top Mark Twain in TNG, and that two-parter. Like, it was just, even as a kid, I thought it was funny, and it just kind of worked in its weird way. And that was fine, but then when it gets pushed into the silliness and absurdity in trying to use that method to reach an understanding in a conflict with Captain Kokar. It's a little silly. It fits the premise of the show though, and the comedy element. So it worked in that regard. And as far as just for my personal taste, that was a little. There are these moments a lot of times in Lower Decks where I love so much of it, but kind of like when I'm watching Rick and Morty with my wife, I'm not really a big fan of it, but she's a really big fan, and I like it more because of the experiencing it, with her, like through her eyes. But there's always these moments where it goes a little too far for me, and that kind of had that moment here where it was from a personal taste perspective was a little too silly, but it wasn't outside of the confines of what the show does. I don't think it was a bad element, and it does deal with playing with some common narrative conventions within the franchise, so it was an interesting perspective on exploring a part of the way conflict resolution is structured throughout much of the writing in Star Trek. It was a kind of a comedic way of exploring that, so that was fine in that regard. Just one of those things where I always wish Lower Decks pulled it back a little bit and it would be like a perfect show, but just a personal taste thing. I really loved everything with the Orions though, and coming to the idea that a person's cultural background is a huge part of who they are and the foundation, but it's not defining of who you are. Who you are is who you choose to be. You take those elements that built you, those pieces of your past, and you find a way to utilize them to make them a part of yourself, but they don't have to be confining and defining. You really are, who you are as an individual. And I thought that all worked really well. So this was, I think, an overall great episode. I really liked it. And I thought it balanced the humor and the lavishness of the exploration of Orion culture without going too far into ridiculousness. It showed a lot of the very over-the-top elements of the culture, but also showed that it's not a culture that is entirely defined by space pirates and sexy female pheromones. It's just a part of a larger culture, and that's been explored a couple of times, especially the crossover with Strange New Worlds again, and I think they've done a lot to add to that, and I'm actually excited to see how much further they explore this culture, as it seems to be one of the ones focused in this franchise. Oh, the classic Star Trek episode, the troublesome alien dignitaries or the ambassadors. Every Star Trek has at least one episode where they use this motif, and it has always been one of my favorite Star Trek narrative tropes, because it always works out well, whether it's done in a more dramatic fashion in things like Journey to Babel, or in more comedic fashions. It's always something that is fun. So my hopes were high moving into Empathological Fallacies. And after watching the episode, what did I think? Well, starting off, my hopes were very high for the episode, as it begins with a focus on T'Lyn, and it's revealed that they are ferrying some Betazoid ambassadors to Risa. And being a big fan growing up of a lot of the more exuberant, often bombastic and silly fun brought by Lwaxana Troi on TNG in particular, I was like, alright, this could be something very funny, very humorous, and having a Vulcan deal with a lot of that is a perfect setup for some great comedy. And the entire crux of the episode is based around the plots of previous episodes that used this device. When the crew begins to be affected emotionally in something reminiscent to Fascination in Deep Space Nine, or in Sarek on TNG, one of my favorite episodes, and it works well as far as tying into previous Trek storylines, but a lot of it felt like it was just chaotic stuff happening. Like there really wasn't, for the most part, a lot of development. And some of in those older examples that I was talking about, through the lack of emotional control and things that are happening, you get a lot of characters revealing true emotions or exploring the emotional context of a character, and here it felt much more focused on just being silly, and that I felt was a little disappointing. And I really felt like there wasn't quite as much of the development of the conflict that's set up within the first 10 seconds of the episode. You have 3 overly emotional Betazoid ambassadors. Basically, you have like 3 Loxanas with T'Lyn, a very reserved, stoic Vulcan, and right there is just a perfect recipe, and it wasn't quite developed in the manner that I thought it could have been. And the revelations of the true nature of the Betazoids and what is actually going on and the ties to T'Lyn and her emotional state, I don't know, it just didn't mesh as well as I thought it could have, and I felt like it was trying to be a deeper exploration of T'Lyn in some capacity that didn't quite pan out. I didn't think it was a bad episode, I just felt like it was a bit of a misstep in some of the implementation of some ideas that were really solid in their inception. And it felt like in the previous episodes that T'Lyn was beginning to find her place, and then here it's more explored that she feels like she's not finding her place and she wants to go back to her previous position on a Vulcan vessel. And it just felt like maybe it was almost out of place in the story structure. Like maybe if this was an earlier episode in the season, like episode 2, would make a little more sense. But I don't know, it felt like the character was beginning to really become a part of the gang, a part of the group, and start to find her way. And of course there would still maybe be some misgivings that she wasn't exactly here by choice, but it felt more like she was at the beginning part of forming these relationships rather than someone who was already in the midst of forming them. So in a lot of ways, this episode was just not quite there for me, but I like a lot of the ideas that are within it, and it was at least an interesting, kind of fun time. Just wasn't one of my favorites so far. And anyway, that now catches me up on Lower Decks, and I'm looking forward to next week.